Hello, Mayor of Baltimore. My name is James Mann, and today we'll be presenting an argument for reforming Baltimore's drug policy. The current policy that is a result of the war on drugs is a national example of systematic racism that negatively impacts Baltimore more than almost anywhere else in the country. The war on drugs fosters racial disparities, facilitates violence, mass incarceration, and safety issues. Because these consequences affect Baltimore at unproportionately high rates, the reform of the war on drugs policy must begin here.
To paint a picture of the severity of the racial inequalities and other consequences, here are some chilling statistics describing Baltimore today. To highlight racial disparities, we can look to income and life expectancy inequalities. There's a major gap in median household income. 2015 statistics show white families from Baltimore have a median income of $60,000. And African American Baltimore residents are at $33,000, which is exactly 55% of the white income. White babies born in Baltimore have 6 more years of life expectancy than African Americans born here. The problems of violence and over-incarceration can also be seen through these statistics. The murder rate is 11 times higher in Baltimore than the U.S. average. Incarceration rate in Baltimore is 2.75 times higher than the national average. Incarceration for drug offenses in Baltimore is 28%, compared to 16% on average nationally. Perhaps the most telling of our current situation, however, is the intertwining of racism and mass incarceration. To start, 2015 statistics show the incarceration rate is 4 times higher for African Americans than whites. African Americans in Baltimore are more than 5.6 times more likely to be arrested for possession of marijuana than whites, even though marijuana use among the races is similar. African Americans make up 64% of the Baltimore population, but account for 89% of those incarcerated.
The disparities presented in these statistics are the result of innately racist policies implemented for political gain. The war on drugs began in an effort to target certain ethnic and political groups. John Ehrlichman, an aide to President Nixon, has been quoted saying, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to either against the war or blacks, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. If these policies were put into effect to disrupt American communities, why are they still in place today?" These communities were disrupted and targeted through over-aggressive policing and mandated high jail time for non-minor offenses.
To get past the cloud of statistics and history and make our point, the primary consequence of the war on drugs is systematic racism. This manifests itself through a variety of ways, such as lost personal opportunities for those that are arrested, wasted tax money on incarceration, gang violence, and overdose deaths.
So there are 4 key issues that are brought about by the war on drugs in Baltimore, and those are mass incarceration, violence, safety issues from using drugs, and addiction. And we can solve or reduce all these problems by attacking them at the root and simply decriminalizing drugs in the city of Baltimore. This would help lower mass incarceration, as we would stop wasting tax dollars on maintaining prisons and holding prisoners, and it would also stop hindering minorities' access to work opportunities. For violence, it would take away the primary root cause of violence in gangs, which is the illegal drug trade that causes turf wars. It would help with safety issues, as for those that do choose to use drugs, they would be more heavily regulated to make their use as safe as possible. And for addiction, it would tear down the stigma associated with getting help for drug addiction and make help more accessible to those who need it. Because of the current stigma towards drugs, decriminalizing them would be met with much resistance, but confronting the evil of racism in our government is worth fighting for.
The decriminalization of drugs is a reasonable solution because the consequences of this aren't as severe as we perceive them to be, and the benefits of doing so would outweigh these consequences. The negative stance on drugs is fueled by the possibility of addiction and death. These morbid consequences of drug use can be countered with strict regulation, continued use of needle exchange programs, and increased accessibility to the use of drugs such as Narcan. The current solution is to send an offender to prison to remove him or her out of society. But while this may help fight addiction, it ultimately results in a criminal record that prevents him or her from obtaining a job, housing, or health care, which constitute 3 of the 4 social determinants of health. Furthermore, for the past 40 years, large amount of government expenditure has been spent on anti-drug law enforcement, contrasted by the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives and increased drug use and trade. With the decriminalization of drugs, drug revenue could generate a great deal in taxes, benefiting our local government instead of expanding criminal organizations.
The primary barrier to enacting this policy change is the negative public perception of drugs that exists today. Currently, the fear of decriminalizing drugs is greater than society's willpower to stop structural racism. In order to reverse the negative effects of the war on drugs, we need to address the problem at the source. The problem is a political one. As long as the voting population is unaware of the negative effects, they will continue to vote for politicians who believe the same. The problem then becomes how to implement this policy. One approach is to start with a small community within Baltimore to prove that this change in policy works, and therefore to shatter the stigma about drugs. Collaboration between the police, government, and public health officials must be unified in this effort. Just as the success of the needle exchange, implemented by our very own Peter Bielenson, has driven its own growth, the short-term success of a small-scale version of the policy would work to fuel larger-scale reform.
In conclusion, the war on drugs is an example of political policies that lead to the systematic racism that heavily impacts Baltimore in particular. This racism creates a wide range of issues. We propose that decriminalizing drugs in Baltimore will address the root cause of these issues and will decrease racial inequalities, helping to create a better Baltimore. To overcome the resistance from the public that such reform would inevitably entail, we recommend an implementation procedure that would start small and use its own successes to further policy adjustment.